And then And here I'm back again, another week of YouTube Live talking about Docker, DevOps, Kubernetes, all the things containers. And in case this is your first time on this live show, this is an hour on Thursdays that I spend usually talking with a guest about something involving containers, whether it's Windows or Linux, in the cloud or in your data center. We usually talk about it here, and we take your questions. So one of the first rules is if you have questions about Rancher, which is the topic we have today, we're taking those questions throughout the hour. So get those in early. We'll kind of go through them in order. And I just want to welcome you to the show, the co-founder and chief architect of Rancher Labs, Darren Shepherd. Welcome to the show.
Yeah. Hi. I'm excited to be here.
Thanks for showing up. I really am excited to have you on. I'll be honest, I'm a little bit nervous because I've seen you for many years putting out great products, and you've been an instrumental part of the container ecosystem. And it's just great to have a conversation with you. And we're going to do it live on the internet, so why not? In case you don't know about Darren, in case you haven't seen I Build the Cloud on Twitter, or if you haven't seen one of his many videos from all the different conferences he talks at or the other podcasts he's been on, because he's everywhere. Let me give you a little bit of background on him. He's the co-founder and chief architect at Rancher Labs. Prior to Rancher, he was a senior principal engineer at Citrix, where he worked on CloudStack, OpenStack, and Docker, and built the next generation of infrastructure orchestration technology. He specializes in building systems to reliably control completely unreliable systems. I love that. Reliably control completely unreliable systems, which is basically the internet, and is happiest when he's banging away at anything but Java. And you'll see his little Twitter handle down there, so I recommend follow him because he's constantly talking about container stuff that he's working on, and you never know when you're going to find like the next big Rancher thing that he just happens to drop on Twitter some random weeknight or something. So, like I'll just go to the first topic. This is exactly how I found out about K3S. Is like one day you just kind of went on Twitter and said, "Hey, I have this thing."
Yeah. I mean, well, that was actually the kind of the birth of K3S. It was never actually intended to be like a product or a project that was like a first class thing. It was more of, I built it as a side effect of working on Rio. Mm-hmm. And some people, just because everything we do is at Rancher is open source, and everything I do, it's up on my GitHub, and people just kind of notice things. And some people noticed K3S, what I was doing, and they're like, hey, that seems interesting. So I kind of put it up on Twitter and said, hey, anyone else interested in this? And I was quite surprised how many people thought it was interesting. So it's like, actually, after I got kind of like an initial interest in K3S from Twitter, then that's when I kind of decided, well, hey, maybe we should turn this into a first-class thing and actually turn it into a proper Kubernetes distribution and everything. And then, just a couple months later, then we actually made like a real announcement of it. Yeah.
Right. The company made the announcement instead of you on Twitter. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's how kind of most of the stuff works, is like, if you want to have an idea of what Rancher is going to announce in another, 6 months or so, just kind of follow me on Twitter. Because I hate the idea of like the last thing I ever want to do is like work on something behind closed doors for like 6 months to a year and never get user feedback. So it's like, I love putting things out there just completely raw, just seeing what people think and get some feedback, and then once it's more baked, then we turn it into a product or whatever.
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, the internet will give you their opinion. So
yes,
there's no shortage of that. So for those that don't know, let's back up and talk about Rancher first, because I think that if people don't know about K3S, they may not know about Rancher. So So Rancher Lab is the company, right? Mm-hmm. And then Rancher's a product.
Yeah. So sometimes that can be confusing. It helps us. It hurts us. I don't know, from marketing.
Docker's the same way.
Yeah. So it's like Rancher Labs, and then our main product, basically pretty much the only thing we really sell is Rancher. Rancher is a company we've been around for a little over about 4 years, I think. Yeah, about 4 years. So we got started just a little bit after kind of Docker came on the scene. And so we've been there since kind of the beginning of Docker and containers, and now we're heavily into Kubernetes. But so Rancher is a company, just kind of the overall, we just are trying to help people more easily use containers and Kubernetes. And if that's the one thing you can think of, kind of what Rancher is like as a brand or whatever, is like we just really try to make things easy. But so we sell, like, our main product is Rancher, which is a multi-cluster management platform. So it's designed to manage Kubernetes clusters wherever you have them. If they're, a cloud distribution like GKE or AKS or EKS, or if it's your own version of Kubernetes, or it's our distribution. We have our own distribution called RKE. So it's a management platform. It makes it really easy to stand up Kubernetes clusters, or you can import existing ones. You can manage the authentication, the authorization, deploy monitoring and logging, and it just really helps you just end to end, you know, end to end with Kubernetes. And so, it's 100% open source. Like the way we work as a company is we just sell support for the open source product. So if you are like one of our actual customers, you're running basically the same open source code. So it's all available as open source. You can run it. It's extremely easy to get up and running. And then, so that's kind of like the core of what Rancher is as a company. And then, some of the other things, we'll talk about today is in kind of the beginning half of this year, we launched a bunch of new projects. So it's like Rancher, our current product we're selling, we announced that like that was a year and a half ago about. But like, starting the beginning of this year, we've kind of had this roll of new projects that we've been announcing, and we just have so much in the pipeline of what we're doing. Yeah. And so K3S was one of them.
Yeah, and this is all centered around Kubernetes as like the backbone, right? Like of all these technologies.
Yeah. So when we started, we were we had a product. It's Rancher 1.6 is our legacy product, and it's extremely popular. And that one was focused. It supported Docker and Mesos and Kubernetes, and multiple orchestrators. When we went to Rancher 2.0, we just 100% focused in on Kubernetes. And so that's kind of where we are, is just focused on making Kubernetes the most usable possible for people.
Right, which is key. I think we talk a lot about on this show is usability, and I come from a sysadmin background, so I've dabbled in development my whole career, but I always talk about that I'm a wannabe developer because I'm rarely paid for my development skills. I'm usually paid for my operator skills.
Yeah.
And so, but being in both those camps is what allowed me to do DevOps before it was called DevOps, right? Like when we all understood that we just needed to increase deployment speed and all that stuff, and we knew we had to automate basically. And so a lot of people that come into my workshops and come into this as students, you get all backgrounds, but there's a really large increasing number of those over time that are the operators, the sysadmins that are trying to figure out these tools that were more designed sometimes for developers than they were operators, right? And it can be really challenging, I think, when they're new to YAML. they're new to automation in general. They're maybe coming from a background that's more traditional infrastructure where it's a lot of button clicking and so it can be just Kubernetes itself is a huge uphill battle. And I love the idea because I can remember when I read that tweet from you on K3S, and it, of course, like everybody, it's like it took us a minute to figure out what you were talking about. And I looked into it and I started understanding, and I was like, okay, this is what a lot of people need out of Kubernetes. And someone told me, tell me if this is true. Someone told me at DockerCon that in your talk you were saying something about you were trying to make Kubernetes as easy as Swarm or something like that. Is that true?
Yeah. And that was like when I was talking to people on Twitter about this. I was kind of asking people. I'm like, hey, what if we had it's like you had like the power of Kubernetes, but it was as easy as Swarm. Like, is it possible to actually package up Kubernetes in like that same simple Swarm approach? And so I really, what I did with K3S, it takes a lot of inspiration from Swarm. I'm a huge fan of a lot of the interface and user experience that Docker has done. And so I would love to be able to, and you see this reflected in a lot of our products, and you'll see this even in Rio. We talk about that a little later, I'd love to bring more of that user experience that Docker's done such a great job on into the Kubernetes world, into the larger Kubernetes ecosystem. So for sure, I do give credit to, like taking a lot of inspiration from Swarm from when we put together K3S. Yeah,
I think, that's one of the great parts of software in general, but especially open source, is that we don't necessarily have to take code from other projects, but these ideas of, one-liners that aren't littered with tons of options, or YAML that you can actually deploy that's less than 100 or 200 lines, and it's not 3,000 lines, right?
Exactly.
And that's it's a real challenge too, because I think we're constantly trying to figure out unopinionated. Like I would argue that Swarm is a very opinionated orchestrator. Kubernetes comes out of the box totally unopinionated. And I feel like the distros, this is one of the things I say, I don't even know if it's true, but I feel like the distributions of Kubernetes are, the more that they try to get a little opinionated, the easier and better they get for those people that want that particular distribution.
Right. And this was because, for anyone who follows me on Twitter knows that like I'll complain about things quite a bit. I get frustrated with technology, and I'll be vocal and kind of complain about the complexities and the difficulties of Kubernetes and how hard it is to get set up and all those things, whatever. But I also appreciate the fact that like Kubernetes, the core Kubernetes is not opinionated. And that's, I think, probably one of the reasons why it's so successful is because it's not opinionated. And I don't think it's the core, their responsibility to be opinionated. They just kind of basically need to produce the best technical assets. And then K3S, where we're a distribution, we have the ability to then introduce an opinion. And if it makes sense for our users, it makes sense. If it not, there's plenty of other options. I think it's really a nice balance that exists, that we have the ability to do that. And so it's like K3S, we just tried to, I don't know, just kind of our experience of running Kubernetes for these years or whatever, just kind of put it together in what we think is the most practical way it's going to hit, the more than 80% use cases. That's what we've done with it.
Yeah, I think it's great. And what you said, only 6 months, right? Or something like that it's been an actual project or something.
Yeah, it hasn't really been that long. It seems much longer because it's been pretty crazy since we launched it. It got picked up so quickly.
Yeah.
But yeah, it hasn't really been around that long. And for people who are interested, we are going to have we're really, really focused on producing like the GA production quality. Cause like right now we still say it's, kind of like beta, although plenty of people are putting it in production. It is still just upstream Kubernetes. Like it's Kubernetes. So it's not, but we are by the, before the end of the year, we're going to have a, kind of like the 1.0 of K3S.
Yeah. And I just saw here, the certified Kubernetes label. One of my questions was actually going to be, were you going to go for being a certified distribution? But it looks like you already are. So
yeah. And that was one of the things was we actually we were certified on day one, like when we first announced it as a company, because that was like our idea was that we didn't want, like, we just want to make Kubernetes easier, but we don't want to make it different. I mean, it's like we still want it to just be Kubernetes because that's kind of the beauties that plugs into this huge ecosystem. But if we can make it easier to install and run and manage and everything. So on day one, we were actually when we actually officially announced the project, we were certified. And we actually, part of our CI process, we run the end-to-end tests.
That's cool. And one of the things that, I don't know if you mentioned this or not, but one of the things you're doing is you're making it easier by taking out things that are rarely used or unnecessary in a lot of cases, and then you're adding in sort of functionality that we almost all already need already. And like, is that kind of how it's, because I see the list here. It's like a nice little removes and adds list on.
Yeah, and so what we found out, so we removed a bunch of stuff because basically we wanted to be a smaller footprint, and what we're finding actually with a lot of the stuff that we removed is we're really figuring out what has made the biggest difference, because we don't want to remove things, like as much as possible. We don't want to have to drop certain features or whatever, because we wanted to still just be regular Kubernetes. So we mostly focused on the biggest things that you'll see for K3S that are removed is the cloud drivers and the storage drivers. And the reason why we remove these is both of these things are being pushed outside of Kubernetes, that you can install them through a CSI plugin or an external cloud provider. And these two components add just a substantial amount of weight to Kubernetes. And so we remove those things. but what's I think a little bit more interesting is the stuff we actually added to it, and it's how we package it. And so one of the key things that we've actually done is because we target, we target kind of the smaller use case, because K3S is very popular in the edge use case or ARM devices and whatnot. Is we've actually replaced or made, besides etcd, you can continue to use etcd, but you can also use SQLite or MySQL or Postgres as your backend storage. So the SQLite backend is extremely lightweight. That cuts out a lot of memory, a lot of footprint.
Yeah.
And then so it's like when we built K3S, we initially marketed it towards edge because we thought that was a real business use case, because we have real demand for that. We have people kind of want to pay us for that. But then what we saw is after we announced K3S, it immediately got picked up for development because it was just smaller and lighter. And so we're seeing people preferring to run K3S on their laptop over Docker for Mac or Minikube, just because it's a little lighter weight. And there's this great project that popped up. I had nothing to do with this. This was actually just purely community, but we kind of adopted it as like official Rancher thing. But it's really just a community project called K3D, which is a wrapper around K3S to quickly spin up K3S clusters in Docker. So if you have Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows already installed, and you install K3D, I mean, it's literally just a couple seconds. You get a Kubernetes cluster up and running, and you can launch multiple clusters. You can launch clusters that have multiple nodes. It's really quite a cool tool for development, and so we're seeing that tool for development is just taking off quite rapidly.
Yeah, and I think more ways. I mean, Docker for Mac and Docker for Windows are great, but it doesn't fit every use case, and you don't always have Docker for Mac, or you don't always have Mac or Windows. And whenever we talk about Docker for Mac and Docker for Windows with anyone at Docker, the next question, we're going to get the question, hey, when are you going to have the Docker GUI management thing for Linux? And all the engineers want to build it, but the customer demand is, I guess, low enough that they can't justify it to the product management. So I found K3D on GitHub. I think this is the right one.
Yeah. So it's just a GitHub. Yeah. So there you go. It's just a GitHub page right now. We don't have a site set up forever.
Yeah.
And this is just managed by some community members, and they do a great job at this. We're hoping to be able to actually Rancher itself put more effort into this project.
Yeah, I mean, I'm putting together. I'm working with Jerome Petazzoni. I don't know if you know him.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And we're working together on a Kubernetes course we're launching later this year, and we're actually getting ready to update my first course, which was Docker Mastery, with a Kubernetes section, because it keeps growing. The original course, we keep adding more and more to it years later, and a large part of it was, okay, we need to all the different ways people would want to have Kubernetes for learning it, right? We're going to have people that want to use Docker desktop, Docker, Mac and Windows, because they already have it, and we're going to have people that are on Linux, and they're going to want to know that easy setup. And if they're on Ubuntu, maybe it's micro K8s or mini Kubernetes, or there's a lot of options, right? And then if they don't, maybe I've had people in my workshop on an iPad, and I don't know what convinces them that that's a good idea, but they show up with an iPad, and I'm like, okay, well, now you're going to use, play with Kubernetes or something like that on a web browser. Yeah. So I'm excited that, the easier we can make it, right? If it's a one-liner, if it's just a couple of lines, I'm a fan of it, because the challenge is not usually for people learning it to learn every possible Kubernetes command. It's usually okay, how do I do the 80-20 rule, the 20% of things that everybody needs to do? How do I do that in Kubernetes? So, if it can do that, that's great. And it sounds like you've got all the key components in there. At first, I was unsure. I was like, okay, well, what doesn't work? And if it's so small, then why isn't it all the distributions this way? Yeah.
I mean, so there are some things. I mean, the main things is because we kind of feel like the cloud providers like GKE or EKS or whatever. There's not a strong reason to not use those products if you want more control, but just kind of over time, they'll probably just get better and better. And so we really focus with K3S of just kind of running it in other ways that are not necessarily going to be your large cloud scale deployment. And so Right now, just tons and tons of people are using it for like dev CI because it's so small and it's so easy to launch. It's found a nice use case there, but then also the edge use case, on Raspberry Pis. It's like, I don't think there's really at this point. I don't think there's an easier way to run Kubernetes on ARM than with K3s.
Yeah, and that was one of the questions we had in chat was, does K3s work on Raspberry Pi 4?
Yeah. And so there's a lot of great blogs. So Alex from OpenFaz has put together a lot of great blogs on how to run. I think some on just K3s, but also OpenFaz. But he usually uses K3s. But he's just got a lot of like good material for Kubernetes and running on Raspberry Pis. So
yeah, Alex, I'm a fan of Alex. Actually, we're talking now about being back on the show here in the next couple of months. Alex Ellis.io is his website, and when anyone gives me a Raspberry Pi question, I send them to Alex's website or to the Hyperpilot.
I don't know. I was like Hyperion.
Hyperion, yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Alex is a big fan of Pis and does a lot of cool stuff with it. And yeah, several other Docker captains are big Raspberry Pi peoples too. So, and in fact, I was pulling up your Twitter because I saw the looks like the 3D print version of the Rancher logo, and that's pretty cool. Is that can someone get that? Is that downloadable?
No, they're not. They're not available to purchase. But Mark Abrams, he is one of our field engineers, had put that together. So he designed and 3D printed that whole thing, and he brings that to a bunch of demos and conferences, and we have a whole bunch of them. And I think we're trying to figure out how to kind of make them more en masse to give them to people. Not really our expertise, but
yeah,
but,
true.
But it's,
maybe it's at the booth, right? Like if you get to the booth and you say I'm a fan of Raspberry Pis, they pull it out from underneath the booth and they give it to you. That would be cool.
I've got about 6 of those actually on my desk at work here.
So if you put all 6 of those together into a cluster, then it would be, you would have your cattle, right? So you'd have a ranch at that point. Yeah. This is my ranch. It's not a cluster anymore. It's my ranch. Because I love all the cowboy references. So
Well, when the funny thing, when we started the company, it was there was Docker, and Docker's a whale, and so like everything at that time was like whale, like everything was aquatic related.
Yep.
And even Kubernetes is a ship in the water, and so we're just like, we want something completely opposite. Like what's so we're gonna be cows and ranch or farms. Yeah.
And it was great, cows or bird watching. Like that, maybe that would be but with ranching, you get all sorts of, like, you can give people, instead of the red hat from Red Hat, the fedora, you can pull out cowboy. I mean, there's so many opportunities. You could dress like a cowboy. You could play Old Town Road, like the new hit song this year.
We have a really enthusiastic user group in Japan that likes to do this horn thing, and they're just great. So we have like some of the best users in Japan.
All right. Well, I'm going to look for that Old Town Road remix, Rancher style from Japan, because that'll be. It's going to guarantee you to be. They got to be synchronized dancing though. It's got to be synchronized.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, okay, so we've got a bunch of other stuff to go through. I want to just get people sort of the highlights of some of the other cool projects you all are working on. So we started with Rancher, which is I'm just going to make sure I get this right. Rancher is a way to build and deploy and manage multiple Kubernetes clusters, and also deploy Kubernetes applications through a GUI, and also has a command line, right? Like it has a
yeah.
And then K3s is the lightweight distribution that's not yet integrated with Rancher, right?
Yeah, so it's not yet. So in our next, like, it'll be coming out kind of next year. It'll get fully integrated into the product, and all the projects that we're talking about today, everything's going to get rolled into the product in some pretty exciting ways. But that's all in the pipeline.
That's pretty cool.
we actually, so K3S is our lightweight distribution. That's getting a lot of traction right now. We already have a distribution called RKE, which is like the full enterprise grade one that's also fairly popular. And also it's pretty easy to install too, but it's not really, it's kind of not on the same level as K3S.
Yeah. What is that when you do, because I know I'm not completely up to speed on to the date, but you don't yet have multi-master
Correct.
right?
Yeah. So, so technically we have. So the thing is we have right now. You can run the K3S in a kind of a manual HA way, but that's never. So that means like setting up multiple masters with an etcd on the back end and a load balancer probably on the front. So it is technically feasible to do it, but that's not kind of what we would like to see for HA. It's like I want HA to be more like Swarm, where it's just like a little bit like more magical and it just works. So while it is technically feasible to do that, most of our users are still just running K3S as a single master because that's the simplest way and it's up and running. And so before we GA by the end of the year, we'll have the multi-master setup working, and that one should end up being like we really hope. We're putting a lot of effort into like just making it like as simple as possible, very similar to kind of how Swarm works.
Yeah, that is. In fact, one of the challenges of Swarm. So I'm a big Swarm fan. And largely from the fact that it was so easy to use, and I knew that like the consulting clients and the people that I was working with, that's what they needed to get started with, right? For them to go from 0 to 100, like I just learned containers to now I'm deploying Kubernetes. Like I knew that was a huge jump for them, and I felt like we needed something else to get them started, right? And obviously, there's been lots of other orchestrators that are easier than Kubernetes, but I was hoping, and it still seems to be the case, that Docker is maintaining it, keeping it updated, so that it can still be that entry point for someone who's already got Docker installed, right? But I was hoping, and I was. I feel like K3OS or K3S rather, because I'm staring at the K3OS webpage, which is the next topic. K3S is like, I hope that it's going to end up being that gateway to the full, like maybe it is then just a distribution that everybody uses. And I was talking with a couple of people in the captain's program when we were at DockerCon, and it was actually before your talk. I didn't even know your talk was happening. And I was saying, I wonder if this new K3S project will end up being a preferred distribution for the solo DevOps, which is I try to be a champion of solo DevOps because there's so many people out there that they've already got a full-time job and they're sort of given you were good enough at that, what you're doing now. We're just going to make you be the person who deploys and manages the servers too. And typically whenever I'm doing a talk, there's a quarter of the room that I get to raise their hands and say they're the only person responsible for deploying into their infrastructure and managing their infrastructure, which is a whole thing that we didn't have a decade ago. Like that was, you typically had to hire a full-time sysadmin or at least get a consultant in or something. And so the challenge is we've got to, for those people, I feel like we've got to make these tools easier. And that's what I think I got the most excited about.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. So I love that user. So I'm a developer. So I'm a developer who tries to act as an operations person, but I'm terrible at it. But that type of individual is like, I don't know, like that's kind of the audience that I love. And so when we built our first version, like Rancher, our 1.0 product, which supported Docker, it was very popular among that community. And I love that kind of that user, whatever. And then as Kubernetes got popular and we went to Rancher 2.0, we've had incredible success with Rancher 2.0 in Kubernetes with enterprise and these larger companies. But I do feel like the users kind of got left behind in these smaller dev shops or the single DevOps guy, and that just really bugs. So I really do hope that K3S can become that solution, and so it is important to me.
Yeah, that's super cool. Yeah, so the multi-master is exciting to me because I wasn't sure if that was in scope. When you started when it actually got like the official web page and stuff, because it went from the Skunkworks project to this is a company project. We're gonna do this thing, and I know multi-master. there's way too many clusters out there with a single master, and it makes me sad. So
Yeah.
And of course, for those of you listening, like if you're already in a cloud, just use the cloud product. Like if you're just getting started, it doesn't mean you have to build your own servers. Like I know as a sysadmin, it's like developers want to make their own code to do the thing that already exists, and for sysadmins, we want to build our own servers to do the thing that already exists. But if you can get approval and get the budget, like do the managed thing if you can, so you don't have to sweat all this.
Yeah.
All these
and
details.
I think it's great too. Like DigitalOcean, I think like they have these days it's so simple to use DigitalOcean to spin up Kubernetes too. That like even for a developer, it's like that's a lot of times your best option. But there's still it's like since I'm a developer and an architect, I really like the architecture of Kubernetes internally, how it's structured. I just kind of see the power of it, and so it's like, well, I want to be able to take Kubernetes and put it into other places besides just the big clouds or whatever. And so, I've always just been playing around with this technology, just like how do we get it into different places? So it's like, it's great that you can get managed Kubernetes, but that's not going to work at the edge.
Right.
How do I run it? So it's like, things like that. So I think there's still a huge reason to have distributions like K3s, but I'm also I'm an advocate for the cloud stuff. It's like, just use it.
Yeah. Hence the Twitter handle. So the K3s, which was this mini distro, seems like it led to these other projects that it enabled, and one of those we haven't talked about yet is K3OS. And I know about Rancher OS because, and I think a lot of people, a common question I get from students is, if I'm deploying containers, should I also deploy Container OS, as if like that is the thing that will make the containers better? And my answer has always been, if you're new to containers, don't sweat a Container OS, because that,
correct, yeah.
If you've got 5 servers, a Container OS probably isn't going to give you a lot of win. It's just going to be a lot of new that you're going to have to learn. And then wait until you're really, really comfortable with containers and you know what you're doing and you're automated a lot of things, and then go for that OS. Would you agree with that, or do you have a different opinion?
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And that was, I would say the kind of the same thing. It's just, how many problems do you want to tackle at once? The idea with Rancher OS was, Rancher OS is just 100% Docker. That's all you can do is run Docker containers. So if you're actually a more mature container user and you've moved to a purely containerized model, then why do you need the underlying OS? But most users aren't, that's not where they start. So it's like, don't just start with a container distribution. You're just going to cause a lot more problems for you. So it's really farther down the maturity, kind of life cycle, I would say. So I think that's the right approach.
Yeah, and so you started with Rancher OS, like you said. So I'm glad you defined that it's meant to run Docker. And then the K3 mini distribution essentially, I guess, spun out the idea that you thought, okay, now we need an OS for this.
Yeah, and so what happened is because we started looking at this as edge devices, but edge devices, you're not. It's like, okay, well, like now I can push software down there and I can manage it with containers, but still, what do I do with the OS? And so we wanted a full stack management of how do we actually manage the whole device for the edge. And so that's where K3OS came, because really the way that we package K3s is we actually kind of have a mini Linux distro in there. We actually have BusyBox. We have a full user space that people aren't actually aware of, because there's zero user space dependency of K3s. So if I want to run K3s in an operating system, technically I just need a kernel, and the boot system, somehow to boot it up. So K3OS was just a way of like, well, what's the minimum we actually need for the OS so that we can fully manage this? So this is something that's going to be very, very heavily oriented towards edge. We'll probably have AMIs for the cloud available, but that's not like the target use case. This is more for ARM devices or like NUCs, little Intel boxes, sitting in a factory or a branch or whatever.
Yeah.
So the big difference between like Rancher OS and K3 OS was like Rancher OS is like it's just 110% Docker. I mean, it's actually we went very aggressive and did a lot of kind of crazy things to make everything run in Docker, and it was very experimental. And we have, and Rancher OS continues to do well. We have a good user base, and it just does one thing well. It just runs Docker. And so it didn't make sense to kind of take that product, which is so heavily oriented towards Docker and the Docker experience, and then say like, now let me build a Kubernetes native thing. So that's why we ended up with two different things. We have K3 OS and Rancher OS. As we continue to work on K3 OS, the intention is actually to merge the technology stack, but we'll probably keep two distinct user experiences. It's like because Rancher OS works really well as the single node Docker, like just run some containers.
Right.
And so people use it. It integrates really well. Like we've seen it. People really love it for like, I have Terraform, I set up a node, and in the user data, I basically put a cloud config that has, run these 3 containers. And so it's just kind of like this bootstrap layer of your container environment. And so that's just worked really well. And so we'll continue to support that use case. But K3 OS is actually geared towards being this completely hands-off, headless. It doesn't really have any configuration to it because it's designed to plug into a cluster and then be managed by the cluster. So it's really a different product.
Yeah. Okay, so K3 OS automatically comes with K3S, right? Like it.
Yeah.
So they're bundled together, and I'm assuming they're running on top of Container D.
Yes, everything is Container D. Like that's so K3S we bundle in Container D. Big fans. I mean, huge fans of Container D. But you can technically with K3S run any, like, you could run it with just regular Docker or even Cryo or something else.
Right.
But we do bundle in Container D. And so K3 OS it's K3S, and then it just pretty much just adds the kernel, the init system, and that's about it. And what we did was we built all the user space for K3 OS is built off of Alpine too. So the OS is just like super simple. It's really just a series of Docker builds and shell scripts. So there's really not a lot to it because most of the heavy lifting is kind of being done by Kubernetes or the Linux kernel.
Right. And so this isn't, so you mentioned earlier, so K3D technically runs K3S inside a Docker, not on top of K3 OS, right? Like, so.
Yeah.
So if I want local stuff just to play with K3S, I can either install it natively or I could look at something like K3D to get it on my Mac or Windows machine. Is that how I would do it?
Yeah, so K3D is kind of your best route for just running K3S on your laptop.
Yeah,
it's great for development, and so it's going to use Docker to actually. So it puts the whole cluster inside of a Docker container, which is great. It spins up really fast. You can delete it really easily. It's pretty cool.
Container inception.
Yeah, but if you're looking to deploy K3S like out on a server, just use the best way to install is really just with a curl install script. You just kind of like the same way you can do with Docker. You just curl the get.k3s.io.
Yeah.
Pipe it to shell, and all it does is it puts a binary in place and sets up systemd or OpenRC, and then you're just good to go. Yeah. So on the page there, just that one liner. Yeah. And it takes about it's less than 30 seconds. You'll have it running Kubernetes.
Yeah, that's pretty great.
And we'll hopefully start getting native OS packages as like I know like the Alpine guys have already picked up. They package K3S, but we're kind of the way we've put together K3S. It's should be pretty friendly to the OS packages.
All right. And we got some questions related to this. So one of them was, any tools out there to get network usage and system application performance in K3S? It's a pretty specific one.
Right. So like this is start getting up a little bit a higher level of like when you start looking at This is not, so K3S is just pretty much the Kubernetes distribution. So now you're getting a kind of a little next up the stack of like, how do I monitor it and everything. And so basically once you have K3S installed in our docs, there's information on how you can install basically the metric server. And then you can put in Prometheus, and then Prometheus will start basically monitoring. We'll grab all the stats from Kubernetes, but one of the things it's like, I don't know if you want to talk about Rio. So Rio,
that's the next question actually, but yeah, let's do it.
Ends up solving some of these problems. Is Rio is kind of addressing like, so K3S is like, I need a Kubernetes cluster. Now the next step is like, I need to run something on it. And so that's what Rio is trying to address is the tagline is it's a microPaaS for Kubernetes. It's just kind of like all the functionality that you would need to run an application on Kubernetes. And so it leverages service mesh and a lot of components from the ecosystem. But basically, with Rio, it's completely Kubernetes native. You can still use kubectl. We also have a CLI that makes it really easy to use, but it's very compatible with the ecosystem. But when you deploy an application with Rio, you automatically get like Let's Encrypt certificates. You get a public DNS name. You get it running on a service mesh, so you get automatic monitoring of all of the metrics, all of the HTTP and TCP level metrics, so like how healthy your applications. It does auto scaling. It does automatic builds based off of Git triggers, like that regular PaaS flow, if you want. So it's just like a gigantic toolbox of of all these things. And so it's a very simple user experience. It honestly, it pulls a lot from kind of my love for Docker and Docker Compose.
Right.
And so it kind of builds a little bit on that type of that user experience, but tries to still be compatible with the Kubernetes world, like not too foreign and not too different. But this ends up solving a lot of those problems of like, once I have a cluster, how do I run an application?
Yeah.
So when you install Rio, you'll already get like Prometheus and Grafana deployed and dashboards and stuff like that.
Yeah. And the related question from the same person here on YouTube was, what are the advantages of K3S over Rio, as Rio is a lightweight PaaS too?
Yeah, so Rio, the funny thing about K3S actually came from Rio. That's what I was saying. Like we never actually intended it to be its own thing. Is when we built Rio, we're like, at first I built this full stack solution of just like, this is the easiest way to run applications. But then I realized it was too much, so we broke it into two things of like, let's give a simple distribution and then a simple application layer, and the application layer can run on any Kubernetes. So Rio works, so there's no specific tie-in that like Rio has to have K3S or vice versa. So Rio runs on absolutely any Kubernetes distribution, and then K3S is just a very simple distribution. So they're two distinct layers.
Nice, but they work together.
They work together in the fact that they still follow the regular kind of Kubernetes architectural boundaries or whatever. So there's no specific integration right now between the two.
Right.
But it's like once you have K3S, then you can just very easily install Rio. So it's like literally in 2 lines, because Rio you can install with a curl script too. That it's like, well, it's really just a CLI. It's a CLI, and then the CLI will install whatever you need in the cluster.
All the tools, yeah.
But like with 3 lines with 3 lines on the command line, you can basically get Kubernetes installed, a full PaaS, and deploying applications from GitHub that are fully monitored with DNS and SSL and all this stuff, which is like 3 simple lines. So.
I know it's not magic. None of this is magic, but there's a ton going on there, and it's one of those things where if you don't look behind the curtain, you could probably you could say that someone could go from 0 to deploying applications as long as they know the YAML, right? Like they know their application YAML for deployments, without having to know how each one of these is securely going to integrate and have all the certificates to manage the connections in the API. And like that's, for implementation projects, that is like, there's so much work in there that these opinionated distribution tools are solving for us. And I'm really excited about Rio as well. So, and that, did you announce that at KubeCon, or was it already out and you just talked about it at KubeCon?
We did a very, so Rio, we did like a very soft launch. We basically just kind of like tweeted and blogged about it. We didn't make a huge deal about it. So you'll see more heavy marketing for Rio. So like that was at KubeCon that we kind of opened that up to the world, but we'll probably do like a heavier push and more marketing. Basically because we've launched these projects K3S, K3OS, and Rio the beginning of this year, and they've all done really well, which is good. But we're also like, because they're doing really well, now we're kind of scrambling to put more resources on, turn them into products. And so it's like, we kind of kept it a little quieter because we'll slowly roll things out. So you're going to see a lot more announcements from us, rolling into next year about what we're doing with these projects.
Yeah, it sounds like I'm sure it seems like it's taking forever, but it's like they're all slowly coming together where it's all going to end up being this layer. I love talking about like the ops stack of stuff. In fact, for a year and a half, all of my conference talks were about, okay, great, all these tools suddenly appeared. Now let's talk about how they all should be going together to make something useful that you can use in real business instead of just the 101 blog post that we all love to write about this particular tool in isolation. And it turned into actually a lot of work. I thought it was going to be an easy talk, and then, of course, trying to do anything in 40 minutes in a talk is always much harder than it should be.
Yeah, and that's what we saw is like as we started like selling like Rancher to users, to our customers, is that we're like, okay, well, there's this rich ecosystem. If you want this, you can pull in this tool and this tool and this tool and do this. But then like our customers, they just get overwhelmed with all of these things, and it's just like, so now they're just coming to us of like, hey, can you just package this really nicely for us, give us the default settings, like, so we don't have to worry about how to make it secure and what's the proper way to run this. It's just, the ecosystem is great, but it's also just a lot for most people to deal with. Just so many things out there.
Yeah, and I feel like the CNCF and this sort of the evolution we've had over the last 6 years. I like to draw analogies because I'm an old tech guy, so I draw analogies to like when we first had virtualization and how, in terms of infrastructure and operations, how this fundamental shift is very similar to that, and a lot of the same patterns existed, but we didn't have Twitter and GitHub and like so many other things that enabled what we now see. And back then, we didn't have 50 choices for ways to deploy virtual machines. Like that would have been made it much harder back then. And I felt like we basically had three options. We had like native Linux stuff, you had VMware, and then Microsoft came in eventually with the Hyper-V and virtual server stuff, you kind of already knew what shop you're in based on the existing infrastructure you had. If you were already a Windows shop, if you're a Linux shop, and it made, I look back and I think, man, if we didn't even have YouTube back then, like if we would have had this level of, I wouldn't say competition, I would say just ideas showing up, and anyone can make an idea happen, and on GitHub, it would have been a whole different ballgame back then, and I think it would have made it a lot more confusing and harder for us as an entire IT world to get to virtualization if we had 50 choices. And I'm glad now that we're getting some opinions around this, because this is, I feel like, how we're really going to get to the majority of people, right? Like if you get past the Silicon Valley and the Linux geeks that we like to just sit around constantly dueling with stuff on the weekends instead of going outside. Like I feel like these are the stacks of opinions that people are going to go towards eventually, and then maybe, like you said, it's all modular. So maybe someday someone will pull out a slice in the middle there and say, well, we don't need, we want linker or whatever, right? So they want something else. So okay, so this is a ton of stuff, and for you watching, if this is all brand new and you know about Kubernetes when you heard of Rancher, but you haven't actually played with any of these tools, don't sweat it. Just rewatch this whole thing over. Go search for Darren on YouTube, and I'm sure you'll find lots of demos. And what would be your recommendation around if they're new to the Rancher ecosystem? Because I feel like that's what you are now. How do they get started? Like, where should they go? Well, let's assume they know Kubernetes and Docker. Like, they know the basics of Kubernetes.
Yeah. I mean, I think like the two main kind of entry points right now is if you're looking to run, you want to be able to just kind of run or manage Kubernetes in production, then go to our main product, which is, you can just find at GitHub Rancher. So go to the main product, and that's going to basically help you deploy and manage containers or Kubernetes clusters for production. It's enterprise grade. It's a great product. If you're looking for, you want to do kind of more development or CI/CD, or you're tinkering with some Kubernetes projects, and you really want to, if you're authoring Kubernetes deployments and fooling around with kind of different YAML and stuff like that, then kind of go the K3S route with K3D, running that like kind of on your laptop. K3D has ended up being a really good tool for people. I mean, we've seen most of our developers here at Rancher have ended up switching over to it, and so that's been good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they're going to start there at the K3S, and then that's when they can kind of start. What about Rio? Is Rio something that they should know Rancher first before they jump into Rio?
No, you don't need to know anything about Rancher. So for Rio, Rio is to me, so it kind of depends on where you are in the Kubernetes life cycle, because we do. The idea with Rio is you should have the basics of Kubernetes down. You should really understand those things. So, but Rio is very focused on applications. So if you're kind of past the hurdle of like, I know how to run Kubernetes and I have Kubernetes running, and that's honestly what most people are just trying to solve right now, is just run Kubernetes. But if you're past that hurdle, hopefully, Rancher's helped you get past that with K3S or our Rancher product. Then I would look at Rio for, okay, now I want to, now I'm looking at a better and easier way to deploy my applications and monitor and scale, how to fit them into a CI/CD pipeline. That's where Rio is going to be.
Yeah. Is Rio, like if I'm an operator and or maybe I'm just like the DevOps person and I have a team of developers that want to deploy to Kubernetes, is Rancher in that area where it's going to help streamline and help me solve that problem essentially, instead of having to do it all myself?
Well, so Rancher is very focused on kind of like the IT operations side.
Right.
That's going to help you run and operate Kubernetes and manage it for a large team or multiple consumers. Right now, Rancher, that product is not going to significantly kind of help you with how do I onboard my end users and get them to consume Kubernetes easily? How do I transform applications and put them on Kubernetes? Currently, like the product is much more focused on the operations side. Right. So that's where we're bringing in Rio, is trying to address that problem of, okay, how do I onboard people to Kubernetes and get people packaging applications and integrating into the workflows.
Cool. Yeah. And you mentioned Git based workflows. We had, I think it was either last week or a couple weeks ago, the conversation was all about GitOps, and and I wrote a long newsletter on it because it's something that's only, I think the words only existed on Google Trends for like 2 years. And I think Weave maybe was the first ones to maybe talk about it.
They were the first ones I heard the term from. So I don't know if they invented it or what, but yeah.
Yeah, well, they have the best resource center on it, so they have the best documentation so far that I could find.
Yeah.
So it sounds like that Rio could fit that model of basically implementing things through Git repos. And if you weren't on the show the last few weeks and you're watching now, the cliff note there is essentially you're using the Git versioning protocol as a way to document and control your deployments, so that it's basically the single source of truth, for lack of a better term. And so it sounds like Rio could assist that, so that I don't have to make sure that my entire stack can talk to Git, essentially.
Exactly. Cool. So with Rio, you can interact directly with Kubernetes if you want, and create your deployments. kind of figure out how things are going to be structured, your applications and everything. But basically, once you've kind of decided what your YAML is going to be, you can then put the YAML in Git, and then Rio will just directly watch Git. And so as you change it in Git, you can watch a branch or a tag or PRs. As things are changing in Git, Rio will just automatically deploy.
Very cool.
Yeah,
I like automation. So when you tell me that it's just kind of plug and play like that, it gets me excited. Because monkeys pushing the buttons, we don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah.
So all right, so these are. I'm sure you've got tons of projects going on. What's the next thing? What's the next thing you're going to release that's going to double the GitHub stars for Rancher?
Yeah. We've got. I don't think I want to let the cat out of the bag yet, but I'm working on another project right now. But we have something that should be coming out. Most companies release things around KubeCon time, so conference-driven development. So we've got something I'm really, really excited about that we're working on, and we'll announce that at probably KubeCon. But basically, like we think we're starting to get a very good foundation between like K3s, K3OS, Rio, Longhorn. We didn't really talk about that, but that's a storage solution that's existed for a while, and we're just kind of making that better. But basically, how we can pull these things kind of all together into a better solution. So we've got a couple things in the works there. So there's another one. We did talk. I have publicly mentioned this.
Okay.
There's another project called K3V.
Yes. I did see that one.
So that one is pretty crazy. It's pretty far out there of basically virtualizing Kubernetes clusters. That's where you can take a large Kubernetes cluster and then chop it up into mini virtual clusters. So this is just currently it's a proof of concept. It worked out pretty well, and so we will be. I can talk about this one. Like we will be putting more effort to this and turning it into a real kind of a real enterprise grade solution. And this solves some really interesting use cases that it's very similar to kind of why you would need VMware. For some of our larger users and customers, there's a desire to run very large Kubernetes clusters because they can get better resource utilization and easier management with running these very large, simple clusters. But then from a user perspective, users want more control over Kubernetes. So we're able to basically chop up a large cluster into smaller clusters and then give people more access to the virtual cluster than they would have of the physical cluster. So it gets a little crazy, but the thing is, it's just a way to run Kubernetes in more different ways, I guess.
Yeah, I know. It's necessary, but also if you're new, it can seem a little overwhelming.
This one is like it's a little hard to explain, but it's kind of like, when you get to that maturity level, then it becomes like, oh yeah, that does make sense. But for most people, that's this is years away for some people.
Yeah. I feel it's a similar conversation I have when someone comes up and asks me about Kubernetes, and then they start asking about like kubevert and Knative and all these other ways to do things. And and I mean, your comment on KubeCon being like the place where people announce it, I feel like it's now like the operators CES, like where there's except for the fact that it's pretty much all about Kubernetes, but there's not a whole lot of operator-focused conferences out there. Microsoft used to have one that was IT Pro only for a couple of years, but there's not a lot out there. So it's a pretty cool conference. Definitely a different vibe than when you went to like early days of Docker when it was a lot of heavy developers and not a whole lot of us operators. We were the last to know. So
yeah.
Well, this has been a great whirlwind tour of all of the Rancher projects, Skunk Works and all. And I thank you so much for being on the show. Where people can find you at I Build the Cloud on Twitter. That's the Twitter handle right below your headphones there. And where else can people reach you if they're not on Twitter? Is there anything else you?
There's the Rancher user Slack. You can find me there. honestly, like, because I get bombarded with quite a bit, so it's like Twitter's about the only thing I actually follow.
Right.
I think I actually like put out a PSA the other day of like, this is about the only thing I follow because my inbox is like overwhelmed. There's too many projects out there. There's too many things.
Yeah.
But just in terms of like Rancher, rancher.com, you can go to there and you can find all links to all of our projects and our GitHub. Our GitHub is, just github.com Rancher. Everything is there. Absolutely everything we do right now is open source. We have nothing that's closed source, so you can use, everything. So
great. And I know that because I get it. I get I think a newsletter, or at least it's a lot of times it's talking about webinars you all do. You do some crazy webinars that are like constant. Like if you were someone who wanted to learn via webinar, like there's some stuff in there that, monitoring on Kubernetes using Prometheus, and like it keeps rolling. So I guess they can get that at rancher.com somewhere. I'm not sure how I got signed up on it, but.
Yeah. So I think if you go to rancher.com, I think there's a sign up for like our newsletter. So we have tons and tons of, kind of probably should have mentioned that. We have tons of like material. It's like, I think it's all up on our YouTube channel too. Just hours and hours of content of, because we've been putting this stuff just together because it's just general container content of just, what's the best way to do X,
Yeah,
so
and of course everybody's putting out container content right now, but I really liked, some of the stuff you guys are putting out is pretty deep, and having visuals and webinars and stuff like that is always a nice alternative to the blog post, which is why this show exists. So thank you so much, Darren, for being on the show, and thank you all for the questions and attending. We'll be back here next Thursday, as always. Live on Thursdays. You just click the subscribe button and click that little bell to get the reminder of when we go live. And hopefully in the future we'll have Darren or someone else from Rancher back on the show to talk more about. I'm sure by the time the end of the year they'll have more projects, as you heard the little teaser there. So we'll be back here. And thanks for watching YouTube Live.
All right. Thanks.